Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtain on one of history's most misunderstood and brutally romanticized figures, the medieval princess. Forget the Disney movies, the singing woodland creatures, and the idea that true love's kiss solves everything. Tonight's story isn't about love, it's about lead-based makeup, political marriages to total strangers, and the soul-crushing pressure of being an air factory. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Our story, like all good princess stories, begins with a birth. So, you're born. Congratulations, sort of. Your first job, even before you figured out how to breathe properly without assistance, is to be the right kind of baby. And in the medieval world, the right kind usually meant having, well, something extra between your legs. Preferably a boy. Oh, you're a girl? Well, that's nice. Try not to be a crushing disappointment from day one, dear. The pressure for heirs, especially male ones, was immense. History quite literally turned on these royal births, and a princess, while potentially useful for alliances, wasn't usually the jackpot your kingly father was hoping for right off the bat. Your very existence is immediately framed by dynastic need, and your gender can be your first, albeit unintentional, political statement. Picture your arrival. No sterile, brightly lit hospital room. No reassuring beeps of modern machinery. Definitely no epidural. The birthing room in a medieval castle or manor was a predominantly female domain, especially in later periods. Though in the early medieval period, monks and friars, being among the few literate people with access to ancient medical texts, might have been the primary source of medical care. Once it became a female-only environment, it was a room likely bustling with midwives, female relatives, and attendants. Your mother, the queen, isn't comfortably reclining. She's probably in a sitting or squatting position, maybe even hanging onto ropes or sheets slung from the ceiling, because back then, gravity was considered a key assistant in the birthing process. A large fire would be roaring nearby, not for a cozy ambiance, but because they believed the heat was good for a woman in labor and, crucially, to keep the newborn, that's you, from instantly turning into a tiny royal icicle in a drafty stone room. So it's hot, it's sweaty, it's smoky, and it's loud. A truly charming welcome to the world. What about medical care, you ask? Well, that's a rather generous term for what was available. The toolkit consisted mostly of herbal remedies, some of which might have been vaguely helpful, others less so. Religious amulets and relics would be present, and prayers would be offered with great fervor. If your mother was struggling, she might be encouraged to call upon saints for help. Perhaps Saint Anne, the patron saint of infertility and difficult births. Or she might have even worn a blessed girdle loaned out from a church, like Westminster's Our Lady girdle, which was popular among royal women like Eleanor of Provence. But actual medical intervention as we know it? Non-existent. This whole process underscores the precariousness of your entry into the world. Your survival, and your mother's, is hanging by a very thin, probably unsterilized thread. And here's a fun, sobering fact. Being royal doesn't grant you immunity from the era's grim reaper. Surprise! Infant mortality was terrifyingly high, and royal children died just as easily and often as those of their subjects. Miscarriages were common, blighting hopes for a healthy, full-term child. Diseases like puerperal fever or childbed fever were a leading cause of death for new mothers. Even if you survived the birth, the world outside the womb was a minefield of infections and illnesses. Consider Eleanor of Castile, wife of King Edward I of England. She bore him 16 children, often while traveling under arduous conditions, yet they lost 10 of those children in childhood. So your chances of having a full complement of siblings to squabble with over the royal rocking horse? Statistically slim. The very fact of your birth is a testament to luck as much as lineage. The birthing room, while managed by women, operated under the shadow of a worldview shaped by male-dominated religious institutions and ancient, often flawed medical theories passed down by literate monks. This creates an interesting tension. Female practical experience meeting male theoretical authority in one of life's most critical moments. But let's say you've made it. You're breathing, squawking, and generally making your presence known. Congratulations, you tiny, surprisingly resilient royal miracle. What happens next is a series of rituals that seem more symbolic than sanitary. The midwife, a crucial figure in this female-centric event, would tie off your umbilical cord. Then, a quick wash. Probably not with the gentle pH-balanced baby soap you're imagining. After that, you might be anointed with salt and honey, or perhaps salt and roses. Why? Well, it was traditional, and in a world where spiritual protection was paramount, these actions likely held symbolic meaning, perhaps for purity or warding off evil, rather than any discernible medical benefit. Then comes the swaddling. You're wrapped up as tightly as a tiny royal burrito, a practice believed to help your limbs grow strong and straight, or perhaps more practically, to keep you from flailing about and to make you easier to handle. And baptism? Oh, that's happening. And fast. Often on the very day you're born, especially if you look a bit fragile, or the birth was particularly arduous. The fear of an infant dying unbaptized and thus barred from heaven was a powerful motivator. Canon law eventually ordered priests to baptize children within 7 days. Your godparents are chosen with care. For a princess, typically 2 women and 1 man of high standing. This isn't just a spiritual sponsorship. It's another layer of alliance building and political networking for your family. So, from your first breath, your life is less about personal comfort and more about dynastic strategy and spiritual safeguarding, a theme that will, unfortunately for you, continue. Now you've survived the perilous entry into the world, been duly seasoned and swaddled. Surely now your royal mother will cradle you, coo sweet nothings, and lovingly breastfeed you, right? Ha! That's adorable. You're in for your first taste of royal outsourcing. Royal medieval women, as a general rule, did not suckle their own babies. Why this apparent detachment? Several reasons. Firstly, breastfeeding was often considered inconvenient for a queen whose schedule might be packed with state duties, travel, or simply maintaining her position at court. Secondly, there was the pressing need to produce more heirs, especially that coveted male one. Breastfeeding can act as a natural contraceptive, delaying the return of fertility, and, in a world with high infant mortality and immense dynastic pressure, getting pregnant again quickly was often a priority. Anne Boleyn, for example, reportedly wished to breastfeed her daughter Elizabeth, but was not allowed to, precisely because of the urgency to conceive a son. And frankly, for the upper echelons of society, it just wasn't the done thing. This immediate delegation of one of the most fundamental maternal roles sets a precedent for a life where personal bonds might often be secondary to status and duty. Enter the wet nurse. This carefully selected woman becomes your primary source of nutrition and, quite possibly, your earliest significant emotional attachment. The selection process was quite specific. Ideally, she'd be young, healthy, good-tempered, brunette for some reason, and, bonus points, have recently birthed a son herself, as her milk was then considered optimal. She would move into the royal household, and her own life would be under intense scrutiny. Her diet, her exercise, her general conduct, even her sexual activity were all monitored, because it was believed these could spoil her milk and by extension harm you, the precious royal infant. If you, little princess, fell ill, guess who was often blamed? The wet nurse, or her milk. Sometimes, a baby's fussiness was attributed to the nationality of the wet nurse's milk. William Rishanger claimed that when Thomas of Brotherton, an English prince, was put to the breast of a French wet nurse, he vomited it up until an English one was found, after which he thrived. Apparently, even royal babies had strong opinions about imported dairy. This reliance on a wet nurse means your first and most intimate bond is with a paid employee whose own child might be neglected or sent away so she can nourish you. It's a system built on social hierarchy and necessity, but one that inevitably shapes your early emotional landscape. And where are your royal parents while all this is happening? Busy. Very busy. Running realms, fighting wars, attending endless banquets, and generally being important. You, little princess, would often be raised in your own separate household, complete with your own retinue of nurses, tutors, we'll get to their delightful curriculum later, and servants. This might sound cold-hearted to our modern sensibilities, this physical and emotional distance from your biological parents, but it was partly a practical measure. It was intended to keep you safe from the rampant infections that plagued medieval towns and cities, and to shield you from the rigors and dangers of constant travel. Dragging an infant across muddy, bandit-infested medieval roads in a springless, bone-jarring carriage was hardly conducive to survival. Your nursery would likely be under the command of a lady mistress, a woman of good breeding tasked with overseeing your upbringing and that of any other noble children in your household. So you're surrounded by a team of staff, but actual quality time with mom and dad? Probably less than your average 21st century child whose parents both work full-time. This early separation, while perhaps ensuring physical survival, could lay the groundwork for a lifetime of complex familial relationships, where duty and distance often overshadowed intimacy. What about your early play and comforts? Well, medieval childhood, even for royalty, wasn't about endless carefree fun and mountains of toys. Children were largely viewed as miniature adults, in training for their future, highly structured lives. You might have puppets, dolls made from cloth, wax, wood, or clay, often dressed in miniature versions of noble attire, so you could practice your future role as a well-dressed lady. Perhaps you'd have some miniature pewter kitchenware, not because you'd ever actually cook, but to understand the domestic sphere you might one day oversee. Noble children, both boys and girls, might also have hobby horses or rocking horses, reflecting the importance of equestrianism in aristocratic life. But much of your early life was about observation and preparation. Swaddling would continue, a practice believed to ensure your limbs grew straight and strong. Surprisingly, you might receive fairly frequent baths, more so than some adults, and oil rubs, if the advice of writers like Walter of Bibbsworth was followed. If you cried, you'd be given the breast, from your wet nurse, remember, not your mother, or rocked and comforted. These were basic comforts. But your world was already being shaped by the expectations and limitations of your royal status. Play was often a rehearsal for adulthood, and comfort was functional rather than indulgent. The very toys you held were reminders of the life you were destined for, a life of display, duty, and domestic management, even if from a gilded distance. So you've survived birth, navigated the complexities of outsourced nourishment, and spent your toddler years as a miniature adult in training. Now it's time for princess school. Forget any whimsical notions of learning potion making with a kindly wizard, or charming woodland creatures with song. Your education, princess, is a carefully curated program designed to polish you into a valuable asset, a desirable bride, a competent household manager, and a politically savvy, but not too savvy consort. Its primary aim is to enhance your value in the high-stakes game of dynastic alliances, and to ensure you can efficiently run a noble household, rather than to foster independent thought or personal ambition in the way we might understand it today. Literacy was a key component, and interestingly, princesses were sometimes more literate than their brothers. You'd learn to read and write, primarily in your vernacular tongue, but also likely in Latin, the language of the church and scholarship, and French, which was the lingua franca of many European courts. Queen Anne, the wife of Richard II, was known for her love of books, and even brought illustrators with her from Bohemia to England. Noble women like Margaret Courtney, Countess of Devon, owned impressive personal libraries, including primers, medical texts, and popular romances of the time, such as tales of Tristram and Merlin, which they often bequeathed to their daughters and other female relatives, indicating a thriving, if somewhat private, female literary culture. Isabella of France, destined to become Queen of England, received a good education in the French royal court from a young age, developing a love for books that would stay with her. Even Henry VIII, a king not particularly renowned for his progressive views on women, recognized the intelligence of his daughters and ensured that Elizabeth I received a rigorous education, sharing tutors with her brother Edward and mastering multiple languages. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was herself a highly educated woman who corresponded with the leading philosophers of her day. This emphasis on literacy for princesses wasn't just for leisurely reading. It was crucial for managing vast households and estates, especially if your future husband was frequently away at war or court. Beyond letters, numbers were also important. You'd be taught mathematics, not advanced calculus, but practical arithmetic essential for household management. How else could you oversee finances, check accounts, manage supplies, and ensure the smooth running of a castle or manor that might function like a small town? You were, in essence, being trained as a medieval CEO, responsible for a complex organization, though your boardroom was more likely to be a solar filled with tapestries. The arts were, naturally, a significant part of your curriculum. Singing lessons were common, as was instruction in one or more musical instruments. Dance practice was also essential, not just for recreation, but as a vital social grace required for courtly life. While records for princes like Henry IV, who played the cithern, are sometimes more detailed, princesses too were expected to be accomplished in these areas to enhance their charm and suitability as hostesses and companions. And then there was religion. Spiritual education was paramount and non-negotiable. You would attend daily mass, learn your prayers, and understand the intricate church calendar with its myriad saints' days and festivals. Often, part of a princess's education involved a stint in a nunnery, where piety and literacy were cultivated side by side. This immersion in religious doctrine was meant to shape your moral character and ensure you upheld the spiritual values expected of royalty. Finally, and perhaps most visibly, you were drilled relentlessly in manners and courtesy. Every gesture, every word, every interaction was governed by a strict code of conduct. You learned how to walk with dignity. You learned how to greet superiors, a slight bow for equals, a kneel on the right knee for those of higher standing, and a complex, multi-stage kneeling process if presented to the queen. The goal was to be graceful, poised, and above all, to never, ever embarrass your very important and politically sensitive family. Your teachers in this comprehensive, if somewhat restrictive, curriculum were a varied cast. Your early instruction in manners and basic literacy might come from your mother if she was actively involved in your upbringing, or more commonly, from your nurse and the lady mistress who supervised the royal nursery. Isabella of France, for instance, was cared for by her nurse, Dauphine de Saint-Pierre, who would have played a role in her early education. As you grew older, specialized tutors would be employed for subjects like languages, music, and more advanced academic studies, particularly if you were a high-ranking princess like Elizabeth I, whose tutors were shared with the heir to the throne. Sometimes, to complete your education and, crucially, to build social networks, you might be sent to another noble household. There, you would learn by observing and participating in the life of another court, essentially serving as a high-status apprentice lady-in-waiting. This practice not only polished your social skills, but also helped forge alliances and understanding between powerful families, a subtle form of social engineering to maintain the cohesion of the aristocratic class. Let's be brutally honest, though. The overarching purpose of this education wasn't to empower you to become an independent scholar or a free-thinking intellectual, with very rare exceptions like Christine de Pizan, who, after being widowed, supported her family through her writings. The primary goal was to mold you into a more valuable commodity on the royal marriage market. A princess who was literate, numerate, accomplished in the arts, fluent in multiple languages, and impeccably mannered, was a prime candidate for a strategic alliance. She could manage her future husband's estates efficiently, entertain dignitaries with grace, and perhaps even offer astute, though carefully phrased, political counsel. An educated princess was an asset. An overly opinionated or overtly intellectual one could be seen as problematic, stepping outside the prescribed bounds of female decorum. Your education was a tool, not for your liberation, but for the advancement of your dynasty. It equipped you with the skills to perform your role, but that role was almost always defined by others. Now that you're educated in the fine arts of looking good, managing a household from afar, and not offending anyone important, let's talk about what you'd actually be wearing. If you're picturing light, airy Disney princess gowns, you might want to adjust your mental image. Think layers, think heavy, think itchy, and possibly think poison. Medieval royal fashion was less about comfort and more about broadcasting your immense status to anyone within a 50-foot radius, and it often came with a physical price. Your most basic, next-to-skin garment would be a quote-quote-quote shift or chemise. This was a simple, loose-fitting underdress, usually made of linen. Linen was breathable, which was a small mercy, considering what was about to be piled on top of it. Think of it as your medieval equivalent of an undershirt and slip, all rolled into one. It was the foundation upon which your entire elaborate outfit would be built. Over this shift, you'd wear a kirtle. This was your main dress, the workhorse of your wardrobe. For everyday wear, it might be made of wool, a sturdy and warm fabric, though not always the softest against the skin. Peasants wore coarse wool. You, as a princess, would have access to finer grades, but it was still wool, and wool, especially in the medieval period, could be decidedly scratchy. The kirtle's style evolved over time. Early on, it might be a looser tunic, but later it became more fitted, often laced up the front, back, or side to achieve a snug silhouette. Some kirtles were even, quote, party-colored, meaning one side of the garment was a different color from the other, a bold fashion statement, and a clear sign that you could afford complex tailoring and expensive dyes. Feeling a bit chilly? Or just want to add another layer of obvious wealth? Then you'd throw a surcoat over your kirtle. Surcoats came in various styles. Some were sleeveless, with enormous armholes deliberately designed to show off the rich fabric and color of the kirtle underneath, because heaven forbid anyone miss the fact that you are wearing two expensive garments. Others were more like full robes, adding warmth and grandeur. The surcoat volti, popular from the mid-14th century onwards, was a particular status symbol for noble women. Its dramatically large armholes often trimmed with fur, revealing the contrasting kirtle beneath. And for truly grand occasions, or if you were just feeling particularly regal and wanted everyone to know it, you'd don a mantle. This was a long, flowing cape, often extravagantly embroidered, and, for someone of your station, almost certainly trimmed or lined with expensive fur, like ermine or miniver. Imagine the weight of all that fabric and fur as you tried to glide gracefully through the castle halls. Let's not forget your legs. Underneath all this, you'd be wearing hose, which were essentially stockings. These were typically made of wool twill and would be tied up at or above the knee with garters made of simple cloth or leather, because elastic was a futuristic fantasy they couldn't even dream of. And on your feet, simple ankle shoes or slippers, usually made of leather. Headwear was an absolute must, especially for married women. Unmarried girls might get away with wearing their hair in braids, perhaps adorned with ribbons or flowers. But once you were a wife, your hair was generally expected to be covered in public. This could involve wimples, cloth coverings for the head, neck, and chin, veils, coifs, close-fitting caps, or hoods. Later in the medieval period, particularly in the 15th century, you might even see the hennin, that iconic, tall, conical hat, sometimes with a veil flowing from the top. Hope you were good at judging doorway heights, or you'd be losing your headwear and your dignity rather frequently. The sheer effort of dressing, and the combined weight and constraint of these layers, meant that simply existing in your clothes was a form of daily endurance. The fabrics themselves tell a story of status. While most of the population relied on wool, durable, warm even when damp, but often coarse and itchy, you, as a princess, had access to a wider and more luxurious range. Your wool would be of a finer quality, perhaps dyed in vibrant, expensive colors. Linen, derived from the flax plant, was used for your essential shift, and could also be used for other garments if you were wealthy. It was softer and more comfortable than wool against the skin. Silk, however, was the ultimate luxury fabric. Imported at great expense, often from the East, its shimmer and softness were unmistakable indicators of high status. A gown of silk, brocade, or velvet would have been a clear statement of your family's wealth and connections. Fur was another critical element of royal fashion, used for linings and trimmings. It wasn't just for warmth. The type of fur displayed your rank. Ermine, with its distinctive white fur and black-tipped tails, was often reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. Other furs like miniver, a type of squirrel, or fox, would also be used. These clothes weren't light. Imagine the cumulative weight of a linen shift, 1 or 2 wool kirtles, a heavy surcoat, perhaps lined with fur, and then a voluminous fur-lined mantle on top. Moving gracefully, or even just moving at all, would have been a significant physical effort. It was a constant, wearable reminder of your elevated, and often constricted, position in society. Now let's talk about what went on your face. Because achieving the medieval ideal of beauty was a serious, and sometimes seriously dangerous, business. The absolute peak of feminine attractiveness in much of medieval and Renaissance Europe was a pale, almost ghostly complexion. Think, quote, delicate flower who has never seen a moment of harsh sunlight or manual labor in her life. This wasn't just an aesthetic preference. It was a potent status symbol. A tan indicated you toiled outdoors like a common peasant. A luminous, almost translucent pallor, however, screamed aristocracy. It suggested you were too refined, too wealthy, too important for such vulgar things as sun exposure. So how did you, our medieval princess, achieve this coveted snow-white look, especially if nature hadn't been entirely cooperative? Enter the magic of cosmetics, or as we might call it, a recipe for slow poisoning. The star product for achieving that deathly chic was Venetian ceruse, a highly popular skin whitener. Sounds exotic, doesn't it? Its primary ingredient was white lead. Yes, lead. That famously healthy substance. What could possibly go wrong? Well, Quite a lot, as it turns out. While ceruse was excellent at creating an opaque, smooth, white finish and concealing blemishes, its long-term use led to a delightful array of side effects. Lead poisoning, of course, but also severe skin damage, including mottling, peeling, and scarring. It could also cause hair loss and, in some unfortunate cases, a rather fashionable early death. Queen Elizabeth I of England was famously a devoted user of white lead makeup, and some speculate it contributed to her health problems and eventual demise. The tragic irony was that the skin damage caused by the lead often necessitated the application of even more ceruse to cover up the new blemishes, creating a vicious and toxic cycle. It was, in its own way, a genius marketing strategy for a product that was literally eating your face. But why stop at just lead? For that desirable rosy blush on your cheeks and lips, you could enhance your ceruse-based concoction with pigments like vermilion or cinnabar. These provided a lovely red hue thanks to their key ingredient, mercury sulfide. So now, you're not just sporting lead on your face, you're adding a dash of mercury to the mix. You're a walking, talking, beautifully adorned, hazardous waste site. Other charming ingredients found in historical cosmetics and skincare included arsenic, used for achieving a clear complexion, or in depilatory creams, goodbye unwanted hair, hello potential chemical burns and systemic poisoning, quicklime, which can burn skin, and belladonna, or deadly nightshade. Belladonna extracts were used to dilate the pupils, creating a wide-eyed, supposedly alluring look. Minor side effects included blurred vision, sensitivity to light, and, oh yes, it's highly toxic if ingested. So your quest for beauty was a daily dance with danger, a testament to the extreme lengths noble women would go to conform to the era's demanding aesthetic standards, often with little understanding of the chemical warfare they were waging on their own bodies. With all this talk of layers and lead-based makeup, you might be wondering about personal hygiene. Let's just say your daily routine as a medieval princess wouldn't involve a long, hot shower with scented body wash. Daily full baths, even for royalty, were simply not a thing. Water was a precious commodity. Fetching it was labor-intensive, and heating enough for a full bath required a significant amount of firewood, which was expensive. Monks, for example, were often restricted to just 2 or 3 baths per year. You, as a princess, might have enjoyed more frequent bathing, perhaps in a padded wooden tub brought to your chambers, but it wouldn't be a luxurious, leisurely soak. It was more likely a quick swill using a jug of heated water poured over your body. Your father, the king, or a high-ranking lord might even travel with his own portable bathtub. Such was the uncertainty of finding adequate bathing facilities on the road. However, hand-washing was a different story. It was considered extremely important, especially before and after meals, largely because most eating was done with the fingers. Elaborate basins and ewers would be provided in the Great Hall for guests to wash their hands, a crucial part of dining etiquette. Soap was sometimes used, typically a basic concoction made from animal fat and wood ash. To make it smell slightly less like rendered livestock, herbs such as lavender or rosemary might be added. For cleaning your teeth, you'd employ a twig, often hazel, to rub against your teeth, or perhaps a small piece of wool cloth. Mouthwash, if used at all, might consist of rinsing with wine or vinegar. Let's just say fresh breath was not a widespread medieval superpower, and close talking was probably approached with caution. And now, for the royal bathroom experience. The privy, or garderobe as it was euphemistically called, sounds rather grand, doesn't it? The reality was somewhat less majestic. It was typically a small chamber or recess built into the castle wall, featuring a stone or wooden seat with a hole in it. Your royal waist would then take a direct, gravity-assisted journey down a chute, emptying either into the castle moat or a designated cesspit at the foot of the walls. If the wind was blowing in the wrong direction, or if your garderobe was unfortunately sighted, it could be a rather breezy and aromatic experience. Privacy was minimal. Some garderobes might have a wooden door, but often it was just an alcove. It wasn't uncommon to find pairs of toilets side by side, sharing the same chute. A medieval two-seater, how companionable. What about the smell? Pungent is probably an understatement. In fact, the ammonia fumes emanating from the latrine shafts were so strong that people often hung their clothes in or near the garderobes, as the ammonia helped to kill lice and other pests. So your clothes might be relatively vermin-free, but they'd carry a distinctive, lingering aroma of, well, medieval sanitation. If the castle moat was stagnant, particularly during the warm summer months, the overall olfactory atmosphere of the castle grounds would be something truly special, and not in a good way. Cleaning these facilities was rudimentary. Perhaps a bucket of water sloshed down the shaft, or if the castle had a more advanced system, diverted wastewater from the kitchens or collected rainwater might be used to flush the channels. Despite these refinements, the garderobe was, by all accounts, a smelly and unpleasant necessity. The hierarchy of stench was a real thing. While your private chambers might be perfumed with herbs and pomanders, the underlying pervasive smells of smoke, unwashed bodies, animals, cooking, and waste were an inescapable part of castle life for everyone, princess included. So you've woken up in your grand, if somewhat chilly and dimly lit, medieval castle. What does your royal day actually look like? Don't imagine too much lounging on velvet cushions, eating peeled grapes. Your life as a princess, while privileged, was also structured, demanding, and surprisingly busy. You'd likely rise at dawn, perhaps awakened by the clang of chapel bells calling the household to mass, as religion was an integral and unskippable part of daily life. The air in your chamber would be cool, possibly damp, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from the fireplaces, beeswax from candles, and perhaps the herbs strewn on the floor or tucked into linens to ward off mustiness and pests. The sounds of the castle would be stirring around you, the distant clatter of pots and pans from the kitchens already preparing for the day's meals, the barking of hounds in the courtyard, the murmur of servants' voices, the scrape of boots on stone floors. Your own chamber floor would be cold stone, perhaps partially covered with rushes or woven mats. These rushes, by the way, weren't changed daily, and could become a rather unpleasant repository for spilled food, dirt, and other detritus, eventually fostering what one account charmingly calls a, quote, fascinating ecosystem of decomposing plants, fleas, and whatever mystery creatures decided to move in. Tapestries adorned the stone walls, not just for their beauty, but as a crucial layer of insulation against the cold and damp, and to add a splash of color and status to the otherwise austere surroundings. Getting dressed was not a simple matter of picking an outfit from a wardrobe. As a princess, you wouldn't be expected to dress yourself. Your ladies-in-waiting would attend you, helping you into the complex layers of your attire, the linen shift, the kirtle, or kirtles, perhaps a surcoat, along with hose, shoes, and intricate headwear. Lacing up kirtles, arranging veils, fastening girdles. It was a team effort, and a time-consuming one. Your morning routine would begin with religious observances. Attending Mass in the castle chapel was a daily duty. Breakfast followed, and it was typically a simple affair. Perhaps some bread and ale or wine, not the lavish spreads often depicted in movies. After this, your work for the day would commence. If you were an unmarried princess in your father's household, this might involve continuing your education or assisting your mother with her duties. If you were married and mistress of your own household, or if your husband or father was absent, your responsibilities would be considerable. You would be expected to oversee the entire domestic operation of the castle or manor. This included managing the household finances, ensuring there were adequate supplies of food, drink, candles, and firewood, supervising the vast staff of servants, and even settling disputes among tenants or household members. You were, in effect, a medieval project manager and chief administrator, overseeing the education and upbringing of any younger noble girls who had been sent to your household for finishing their training as ladies was also a key responsibility. Mid-morning might bring more prayers, followed by dinner, the main meal of the day, typically served around 10 or 11 a.m. The afternoon could involve further housewifely duties, such as checking on the food stores in the larder and buttery, ensuring everything was in order for upcoming meals or feasts, or perhaps some time for approved leisure activities. This is where your princess hobbies came in. Embroidery was a near-constant activity for noble women. It was considered a ladylike pursuit. It was productive, creating beautiful and valuable textiles for clothing, furnishings, or church vestments. And it kept idle hands busy. Music and dance practice were also part of the routine, honing skills essential for courtly life. If you were inclined and had access to them, you might spend time reading. Books were luxury items, handwritten, and often beautifully illuminated. But noble women did read for both pleasure and instruction. Popular romances, poetry, and of course, devotional texts like books of hours. Board games like chess, a game of strategy and status, were a common noble pastime. Simpler games like Nine Men's Morris or dice games might also be played. If you craved some fresh air and activity, you might take a supervised walk in the castle gardens, if such a formal garden existed beyond the practical herb and vegetable plots. Hunting with hawks, or falconry, was a prestigious and popular sport for noble women, requiring skill and patience. Horse riding for pleasure was another option, allowing you to escape the castle walls, albeit still under escort. And yes, even princesses kept pets. Small dogs, cats, and sometimes more exotic creatures like squirrels or parrots, if your family had extensive trade connections, could be cherished companions. The evening would bring another round of prayers, followed by supper, usually served in the great hall around 4 p.m. This meal was often a more public and ceremonial affair than dinner. After supper, if the occasion called for it or if important guests were present, there might be entertainment. Musicians playing lutes, harps, or viols, singers performing ballads, dancers, jugglers, acrobats, or the court jester providing some hopefully witty banter. Storytelling was a hugely important form of entertainment, with minstrels and troubadours reciting epic poems, tales of chivalry, heroic battles, and tragic love affairs. Finally, before retiring to your no doubt drafty royal bedchamber, there would be bedtime prayers. And then you'd try to sleep, amidst the snores of nearby attendants. The inevitable scratching. Lice and fleas were constant companions in a world of straw bedding and infrequent laundry, and the cold drafts that always seemed to find their way through stone walls. What about privacy in this grand castle life? The modern concept of personal, unadulterated privacy was largely non-existent for a medieval princess. Your private chambers were rarely truly private. Your ladies-in-waiting were almost always present, attending to your needs, providing companionship, or simply being there as part of your retinue. Servants would be constantly in and out, cleaning, bringing meals, or running errands. Even your bedchamber, the most intimate space, might be used for receiving special guests or conducting private audiences. Beds themselves often had heavy curtains, which provided a small cocoon of privacy and, crucially, an extra layer of warmth against the cold. The solar was generally the lord and lady's private living and sleeping area, typically located on an upper story. It would be more comfortably furnished than other parts of the castle, perhaps with its own fireplace, tapestries, and better quality furniture, offering a degree of seclusion for the family. However, it was still a family space, not a solitary retreat. This constant presence of others, the lack of true solitude, would have profoundly shaped your sense of self and your understanding of personal boundaries. Life was lived publicly, even for a princess. The castle, while a symbol of power and protection, was also a busy, noisy, and often smelly place. A far cry from the serene and silent fortresses of fairy tales. Your daily grind was a complex tapestry of duty, devotion, and display, with very little room for just being you. So you're a medieval princess. You're probably imagining feasting daily on roasted swan, peacock tongues, and mountains of sugary confections, right? Well, hold your war horses. While your diet was certainly a universe away from the peasants' monotonous fare of dark bread and turnip stew, your daily royal rations weren't always the stuff of legend. Breakfast, for instance, was often a surprisingly simple affair. Perhaps some good quality bread, made from wheat, the fancy stuff, not the rye or barley the commoners ate, and a cup of ale or wine. Not exactly a continental buffet with fresh fruit and pastries. The two main meals of the day were dinner, served mid-morning around 10 or 11 a.m., and supper, which took place in the late afternoon around 4 p.m. These would be more substantial, featuring a variety of dishes. Stews were common, and there would usually be some form of meat or fish, depending on whether it was a meat day or one of the numerous fish days mandated by the church when meat consumption was forbidden. But when a true feast was called for, perhaps for a royal wedding, maybe even yours, a coronation, a major religious holiday, or to impress some visiting dignitaries, then, oh boy, did the castle kitchens go into overdrive. A medieval royal feast was not merely about eating. It was a full-blown theatrical production, a spectacle designed to showcase the host's immense wealth, power, and sophisticated taste. We're talking a caloric intake that would make a modern nutritionist weep. Courtiers at some feasts were estimated to consume around 5,000 calories in a single day. The menu for such an event was a carnivore's dream. Meat, and more meat, in every conceivable form. Roasted beef, venison, a noble favorite, often from the Lord's own hunting expeditions, pork, mutton, lamb, and a veritable aviary of poultry, swan, peacock, heron, pheasant, partridge, quail, lark, and capons. Boars' heads were a popular centerpiece, often served with great ceremony. The coronation banquet of the young King Henry VI, for example, featured an astonishing array of these meats, alongside fish like carp, crab, and pike. If the host really wanted to impress, or if it was Henry VIII dining, more exotic seafood might make an appearance, such as sturgeon and whale, both considered royal fish and thus restricted to the monarch or by their permission, or even porpoise and conger eel. One of the striking things about medieval feasting, especially to our modern palates, was the blending of sweet and savory flavors. Sweet dishes were often served right alongside, or even mixed in with, the savory ones. There wasn't the strict progression of courses from savory to sweet that we adhere to today. Spices were the ultimate status symbol. Since they had to be imported from the distant east, think cinnamon, ginger, saffron, cloves, nutmeg, and black pepper, they were incredibly expensive, worth more than their weight in gold sometimes. A heavily spiced dish was a clear indicator of your host's wealth and international trade connections. Sugar, often imported from places like Cyprus, was also a luxury, used to sweeten dishes and create elaborate confectionaries. Your food was, in many ways, a delicious map of your kingdom's economic power and global reach. And then there were the subtleties, or subtleties. These were the true showstoppers of a medieval feast, the edible entertainment between courses. Imagine intricate sculptures, crafted from marzipan, sugar paste, or other foodstuffs, depicting allegorical scenes, heraldic coats of arms, lifelike animals, or even miniature castles. At Henry VI's coronation feast, the sotelltes were overtly political, with one depicting the young king being held aloft by the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund and his own father, Henry V, while another showed the Virgin Mary with the infant Christ, with St. George and St. Denis presenting the young Henry to her, symbolizing his dual claim to the thrones of England and France. Other examples of sotelltes included a boar's head encased in a pastry castle adorned with gold, or a jelly sculpture featuring a red antelope wearing a crown. These weren't just pretty desserts, they were powerful statements, reinforcing political messages and delighting guests with their ingenuity. Dining at such a feast was also governed by a strict code of etiquette, a veritable minefield of social do's and don'ts. Since much of the food was eaten with the fingers, hand-washing before, during, and after the meal was absolutely essential, and a ritual in itself. The Dutch writer Erasmus, in his list of instructions for dining at court, advised attendees to sit not down until you have washed. Don't shift your buttocks left and right as if to let off some blast. Sit neatly and still. The seating arrangement was a rigid reflection of social hierarchy. The most important guests, including you, princess, would be seated at the high table, often on a raised dais, while lesser nobles and guests were arranged at long trestle tables below. Your place was determined by your rank, and any deviation could cause a major social incident. Sharing was not just caring. It was often a necessity and a rule. You might share a drinking cup, passed carefully so the next person didn't drink from the exact same spot, and even food bowls with your dining companion. The person of lower rank was expected to serve the person of higher rank. Forks, by the way, were largely absent from the dining table for personal use until much later. They were primarily kitchen implements for serving or carving. King Henry VIII was noted as one of an elite few at court to be given a fork, and that was specifically for eating sticky sweet preserves. Most diners, including you, would use a knife, often your own, brought with you as it was a personal item used for many things, and your fingers. Spoons would be provided by the host. Table conversation was expected to be refined and elevated. Discussions of literature, music, or courtly poetry were appropriate. Loud laughter, emotional outbursts, or, heaven forbid, talking with your mouth full or blowing on your food, a real concern given the state of medieval dental hygiene and resulting bad breath, were serious breaches of decorum. Now, for the less glamorous side, food safety. In an era without refrigeration, preserving food was a constant challenge. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling were the primary methods. While the royal court had access to fresher meat than most commoners, who usually ate the preserved stuff, the risk of spoilage was ever present. You had to rely heavily on your senses. If a piece of meat smelled rank or tasted sour, it was best avoided, though hunger might sometimes override caution. Even grain stores weren't entirely safe. Rye bread, a staple, could become contaminated with ergot, a fungus that, when ingested, could cause convulsions, terrifying hallucinations, and even death, a condition sometimes described as being like eating bread laced with LSD and tetanus. While this specific example often relates to peasant fare, the risk of spoiled grain was universal. And then, there was the ever-present, deeply unsettling possibility of poisoning. This wasn't just a plot device in lurid storybooks. It was a genuine fear in medieval and Renaissance courts, which were often swirling vortexes of political intrigue, jealousy, and ambition. Poisoning was considered a particularly heinous crime, even more dastardly than a straightforward stabbing, because of its secretive and treacherous nature. Accusations of poisoning, sometimes fabricated to eliminate rivals or seize property, were not unheard of. The infamous Affair of the Poisons in 17th century France, which implicated high-ranking nobles and even King Louis XIV's mistress, In a network of poisoners and fortune-tellers selling inheritance powders, demonstrates how pervasive and high-reaching such fears and practices could be. So when that elaborate dish was presented to you, especially if it came from a courtier whose loyalty you questioned, you'd be wise to let the official food taster have the first bite. Many royal households employed such individuals specifically to mitigate this very real threat. The political theater of the feast, therefore, was underscored by a constant, low-level threat, not just from poorly preserved food, but from deliberately tainted morsels. The grandeur of your meal was always accompanied by a side dish of potential peril. So, you're growing up, princess. You've learned to read, maybe play the lute, and definitely how to curtsy without tripping over your ridiculously long skirts. But don't get too attached to your childhood bedroom or your collection of finely embroidered handkerchiefs, because the moment you hit an age that's even remotely marriageable, and in medieval times that could be alarmingly young, your primary purpose in the grand dynastic scheme is about to kick into high gear. You're about to become a high-value bargaining chip, sold to the prince with the biggest tract of land, the most impressive army, or the most strategically useful alliance. And if he has a pulse and most of his teeth, well, that's just a bonus. Medieval royal marriages, let's be crystal clear, were almost never about love, romance, or finding your soulmate. Forget heartfelt declarations under a moonlit balcony. Think of them more like complex international business deals, strategic mergers between powerful families or kingdoms, meticulously designed to increase power, consolidate wealth, expand territory, and ensure political stability, or at least a temporary pause in hostilities. Your feelings on the matter? Largely irrelevant. Your parents, or the king, or some council of very serious-looking men in robes are the ones making the arrangements. You might meet your future husband for the first time when he, or his representative, shows up for the wedding ceremony, or perhaps a little before, if you're exceptionally fortunate. And when we say young, we mean young. The canonical age for marriage was 12 for girls and 14 for boys, but betrothals, legally binding promises to marry, could happen much, much earlier, sometimes when the prospective bride and groom were still infants, little more than royal babies themselves. Isabella of France, who will become a recurring character in our little tale of woe, was betrothed to Edward II of England as a key part of a peace treaty when she was just a child, around 8 years old, and the actual marriage took place when she was 12. Another Isabella of France, a different one, was married to Richard II of England when she was a mere 6 years old, though in a small nod to something resembling propriety. The consummation of that marriage was officially delayed until she reached the age of 12. It was quite common for these alliances to pair a significantly older man with a very young teenage princess. The grimly pragmatic reason? To maximize her childbearing years, because producing heirs, preferably male, was your number one job description post-marriage. In 15th century Italy, for instance, the average age for a bride was around 18, and she typically married a groom who was a good 10 to 12 years her senior. This transactional view of your life and future is a core reason why surviving as a medieval princess would be a tough pill for any modern person to swallow. Your personal aspirations are secondary to the dynastic needs of your family and future husband's realm. This isn't just a casual agreement sealed with a handshake and a hopeful smile. Oh no, these are serious, legally binding contracts, princess. Matrimonial contracts were incredibly detailed documents, often negotiated for months, if not years, by teams of diplomats and lawyers, regulating every conceivable aspect of the union. Central to these contracts were the financial arrangements, specifically the dowry and the dower. The dowry, or dues, was the wealth, money, lands, valuable goods, perhaps a strategically important castle, or even a claim to a territory that your family, the bride's side, had to provide to your new husband or his family upon marriage. Think of it as an incredibly expensive entry fee into this new alliance. It was a significant financial undertaking for your father, the king, and a clear demonstration of your family's wealth and commitment to the match. There was a small silver lining. The dowry was supposed to be returned to you or your family if the marriage ended through separation or your husband's death, offering a modicum of financial security in an uncertain world. In return for the substantial offering, your future husband was expected to endow you with a dower. This was a specific portion of his lands and revenues assigned to you for your maintenance and use throughout your lifetime, should you outlive him. The dower lands were meant to provide you with an income and a place to live if you became a widow. The language in the contract, sometimes charmingly or alarmingly, referred to the dower as being, quote, for the honor of her lineage and body, a rather blunt acknowledgement of the transaction taking place. Upon your death, the dower lands would typically revert to your children or back to your husband's family. These weren't just token gestures. Dowries could be immense, sometimes including entire principalities. Teresa, an illegitimate daughter of Alfonso VI of Leon and Castile, famously received the Portugalensim Terram, the land of Portugal, as her dowry when she married Henri of Bourgogne, a gift that eventually laid the foundation for the independent Kingdom of Portugal. So your marriage isn't just about you. It could literally redraw the map of Europe. Beyond these initial settlements, as a queen, you would also be entitled to regular income for your upkeep and the maintenance of your household. This often came in two forms. Mantimento, a kind of maintenance allowance paid in installments from the royal treasury, and revenues from your scamara, which were specific towns or lands assigned directly to you, from which you could collect taxes and appoint officials. This gave you a degree of financial independence and the ability to dispense patronage, maintain your retinue of ladies-in-waiting and servants, dress in a manner befitting your station, and engage in charitable works, all essential for a queen's image and influence. While this might sound like a degree of power, it's important to remember that these financial frameworks, while providing for you, also underscored your role as a managed asset within a larger political and economic system. What about your say in all this? The church, which held enormous sway over marriage, did have rules. Canon law stipulated that both parties had to consent to the marriage for it to be valid. However, the reality for a young princess facing the combined pressure of her powerful father, her family's political ambitions, and the expectations of two kingdoms, was that, quote, quote, e, quote, 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 e, quote, 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 for formality. Imagine being a 13-year-old girl told by the king that she is to marry a man she's never met for the good of the realm. The pressure to agree would be immense, the consequences of refusal unthinkable. To ensure there were no canonical impediments, like being too closely related, or one party already being secretly married, a wedding notice, or bans, would be publicly posted, usually on the church door. This gave anyone with a legitimate objection a chance to come forward. If someone knew, for instance, that the groom was actually your long-lost uncle, or had a pre-existing wife stashed away in a remote castle, this was their moment to speak up or forever hold their peace and risk divine displeasure. The entire process, from betrothal to the final vows, framed you, the princess, as a high-value commodity whose personal desires were almost always subordinate to the strategic interests of states and dynasties. Your marriage contract was less a testament to love and more a treaty written in terms of land, gold, and future heirs. The ink on the marriage contract is barely dry, your dowry has been counted, and probably already earmarked by your new father-in-law. And it's time for the next delightful chapter in your young life, the journey to meet your stranger husband and begin your new existence in a foreign land. So you're packaged up with your trousseau, a collection of gowns, jewels, linens, and other fineries befitting your status and designed to impress your new court, and you prepare to say goodbye. Goodbye to your family, your childhood home, your friends, your language, or at least the primary language you're used to, and pretty much everything familiar and comforting. What was the emotional toll of this departure? For many young princesses, especially child brides, it must have been a profoundly bewildering, frightening, and isolating experience. Imagine being Isabel of Castile, married at the tender age of 8 to Jaime of Aragon, only to be returned home, untouched, 4 years later when the political winds shifted. Or consider Lucrezia de' Medici, betrothed at 13, who later lamented in a letter, "Don't be born a woman if you want your own way." These were not journeys undertaken with joyful anticipation, but often with a heavy heart and a great deal of trepidation. While some later correspondence, like the polite letters exchanged between Joanna of Navarre and Henry IV of England before their marriage, might hint at a degree of formal affection, or at least courteous anticipation, these were likely the exception rather than the rule for a first marriage, especially for a very young princess leaving her homeland for the first time. The reality was that you were often a pawn in a dynastic game, and your feelings were a secondary concern, if a concern at all. Your journey to your new life wasn't a quick, discreet trip in a private jet. Oh no! This was a full-blown bridal procession, a slow, grand, and highly visible spectacle designed to impress, and probably intimidate, everyone along the route. Think of it as a really, really slow-moving, uncomfortable, and incredibly expensive parade, where you, princess, are the star exhibit. Whether you like it or not, the scale of these entourages could be staggering. When Margaret of Anjou traveled to England in 1444 to 1445 to marry King Henry VI, her escort was a veritable army. It included the Duke and Marchioness of Suffolk, 5 barons, 5 baronesses, 17 knights, 65 esquires, and a staggering 204 valets. And that was just the English contingent sent to fetch her, before her own Angevin servants and retinue joined the party for the return journey. The entire enterprise, initially planned for 3 months, stretched to over 7, and ended up costing a fortune, going significantly over budget. These wedding journeys were extraordinary events, involving hundreds of diplomats, envoys, aristocrats, city officials, low-status personnel, soldiers, artists, musicians, and poets, all contributing to the preparation, execution, and commemoration of the event. It was dynasty in motion, prestige on wheels. And how exactly are you traveling? Trussed up in your finest but probably least comfortable gown. Your options weren't exactly luxurious by modern standards. If you were hardy, and the distances weren't too vast, you might travel on horseback, riding side saddle. But for long journeys, especially with the vast amounts of luggage that a royal trousseau entailed, you were more likely to be conveyed in a litter, a covered couch or carriage body, suspended between 2 poles and carried either by men or between 2 horses. Or you might endure a carriage. Early medieval carriages were often springless or had very rudimentary suspension, meaning every bump and rut in the notoriously unreliable medieval roads would be transmitted directly to your royal backside. It was a bone-jarring, teeth-rattling experience. Progress was painfully slow. In the 16th century, even a monarch like Henry VIII, with all the resources of the kingdom at his disposal, might cover a mere 10 miles in a single day of travel. Rivers were sometimes used for transporting goods and could be more comfortable, but they didn't always go where you needed to. And sea travel, while potentially faster for certain routes, came with its own unique set of miseries, including violent seasickness, the risk of storms, and the ever-present threat of pirates. This wasn't a pleasure cruise or a scenic tour. Travel in the medieval period was fraught with danger. Beyond the discomfort of the journey itself, you faced real threats. Bad weather could turn roads into impassable quagmires or make sea crossings perilous. Bandits and brigands were a common menace on lonely stretches of road, and a royal procession, laden with valuables, would have been a tempting target. Illness could strike at any time, far from any familiar comforts or reliable medical aid. And if your route took you through politically unstable territories, you could find yourself caught in local conflicts or held as a political pawn. The logistics of moving such a large party were a nightmare in themselves. Arranging food and safe lodging for hundreds of people and horses each night, navigating unfamiliar terrain, and ensuring the safety of the princess and her dowry required meticulous planning and a healthy dose of luck. Finally, after weeks or even months of arduous and perilous travel, you arrive at your destination, a foreign court, your new home, and the domain of your stranger husband. Exhausted, probably homesick, stiff from the journey, and no doubt feeling utterly overwhelmed, you are now expected to step out of your litter or carriage, looking radiant and every inch the princess, ready to charm your new family, and a court full of unfamiliar faces, speaking a language that might still be a struggle for you. You must adapt quickly to new customs, new political dynamics, and a whole new set of courtiers, some of whom will be allies, some rivals, and some just waiting to see if you'll stumble. Your primary duties are clear. Be a dutiful wife, represent your homeland with grace, build alliances, and, above all, start producing heirs as quickly as possible. No pressure then? Welcome to your new life, princess. Hope you packed your smelling salts. Isabella of France, arriving in England at the tender age of 12 to marry Edward II, found herself in just such a position. Young, in a foreign land, and married to a king who was notoriously more interested in his male favorites, like Piers Gaveston, than in his new child bride. Talk about a challenging start to a marriage. This journey, a profound rite of passage, was often the first and most stark illustration of a princess's life. A public performance, fraught with discomfort and danger, all in the service of dynastic strategy. So, you've made it through the wedding, or at least the journey to the man you're now legally bound to. You're in a new court, possibly a new country, with a husband who might be a complete stranger, and the weight of dynastic expectation heavy on your young shoulders. While you're navigating this cold, hard reality of politically arranged matrimony, there's this other, rather more alluring, concept of love being sung about by minstrels in the Great Hall and written about in fancy illuminated manuscripts. It's called courtly love, and it's probably everything your actual marriage is not. Imagine the scene. Knights in shining armor, their hearts aflame with devotion for an unattainable noble lady, often one who is already married to someone else. How convenient for the drama. These knights perform breathtaking deeds of heroism, not for gold or glory, but purely for a glance, a smile, or a token, perhaps a silk scarf, from their beloved. They suffer beautifully, penning heartfelt poems about their longing, their despair, their undying loyalty. This is the world of Lancelot and Guinevere, Tristan and Isolde, epic, passionate, and usually tragically doomed romances that were all the rage in aristocratic circles. This literary and social ideal, which flourished in courts like that of Marie of Champagne, who was, incidentally, the daughter of the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, celebrated fin amours, or refined love. It was a love characterized by yearning, devotion, and often a profound sense of suffering because it was frequently unrequited or impossible to fulfill. A chaplain at Marie's court, Andreas Capellanus, even went so far as to write a kind of rule book for this type of love, called De Amor, the Art of Courtly Love, around 1185, possibly at Marie's own request. This wasn't a casual pamphlet. It laid out specific guidelines for how a true lover should behave. Some of its most famous, and frankly rather dramatic, maxims included: marriage is no real excuse for not loving, a direct challenge to the pragmatic nature of your own union. Others were: he who is not jealous cannot love, a true lover considers nothing good, except what he thinks will please his beloved, and love can deny nothing to love. The emphasis was on patience, suffering, unwavering devotion, and the idea that this intense, idealized love often existed outside the practical political bonds of marriage. A knight in the throes of courtly love was expected to endure any hardship, any humiliation, to prove the depth of his passion. He might wear his lady's colors in a tournament, undertake perilous quests in her name, or simply pine away elegantly in her absence. Now contrast this with your reality, princess. Your marriage was likely based on a meticulously negotiated contract, signed and sealed probably before you even understood what it meant, focusing on dowries, dowers, land rights, and the all-important production of legitimate heirs to secure the dynasty. Love, if it developed at all between you and your royal spouse, was considered a fortunate byproduct, a pleasant surprise, rather than a prerequisite or even a primary goal. Affection, mutual respect, and a collaborative approach to ruling and heir production were perhaps more realistic aspirations within the marital chamber. So how does a medieval princess, living this stark dichotomy, navigate her inner world? The gap between the romantic ideals she hears in song and story and the often cold, pragmatic reality of her own life must have been vast and, at times, deeply unsettling. Passionate love, the very kind celebrated in courtly romances, could be viewed as a dangerous and destabilizing force if it emerged within your actual marriage and wasn't politically expedient. It was sometimes described as an affliction, even medicalized, and linked to melancholy or madness, especially if it led to behavior deemed inappropriate for a queen or princess. Similarly, excessive grief for a deceased spouse, while perhaps understandable on a human level, could be problematic if it hindered the political necessity of a swift remarriage to forge a new alliance. Your emotions, princess, were not entirely your own. They were subject to political calculation and societal expectation. Expressing strong emotions openly was also a tricky business for elite women. While intense weeping during religious devotion was often seen as a sign of piety and spiritual depth, displaying anger, for example, was generally discouraged, as it was believed to confirm the stereotype of feminine weakness and an inability to control one's passions. So you had to be careful, measured, and always aware of how your emotional state might be perceived and interpreted by the ever-watchful court. Given these constraints, where could a princess find an outlet for her true feelings, her frustrations, her joys, her sorrows? Some upper-class women turned to private letters. These could be a space to express their inner lives, to wield subtle influence, or simply to vent. Nanina de Medici's poignant line, "Don't be born a woman if you want your own way," speaks volumes about the frustrations of her position. The letters of Alessandra Strozzi, another Florentine noblewoman, offer a rich tapestry of her emotional experiences, from joy and triumph to deep despair and anxiety. And the passionate, almost desperate letters of Isabella von Parma to her sister-in-law, Marie Christine of Austria, reveal the profound emotional connections that could exist outside the formal confines of marriage, with declarations like, "I am madly in love with you, virtuously or diabolically, I love you, and I will love you to the grave." Embroidery, that quintessential ladylike pastime, could also become a surprisingly potent form of self-expression. Beyond its practical and decorative functions, needlework offered a way to communicate symbolically, to weave hidden meanings, personal sentiments, or even quiet acts of defiance into intricate designs, when overt speech was too risky or inappropriate. Mary, Queen of Scots, during her long imprisonment, famously used her embroidery to convey messages of her royal status and her unbroken spirit. The psychological toll of this existence, being a valuable political pawn from birth, married young to a stranger, often transplanted to a foreign and potentially hostile court, under constant pressure to produce heirs, and navigating the treacherous currents of court politics while your own emotional life was policed, must have been immense. Many young girls forced into such marriages undoubtedly experienced despair, a profound lack of personal choice, and deep-seated fear. The romanticized ideals of courtly love, while perhaps offering a fleeting, imaginative escape, may have also thrown the stark, unromantic realities of their own lives into even sharper, more painful relief. It was a world where your heart was often the last consideration, and your survival depended on navigating this emotional tightrope with grace, cunning, and a will of iron. All right, princess, you're now ensconced in the royal court, probably married off to some strategically important duke or king, and surrounded by a glittering array of people who are all smiling to your face while possibly sharpening daggers behind their backs. And who are your closest companions in this gilded cage? Your ladies-in-waiting. Now, if you're picturing a loyal girl squad ready for sleepovers and sharing secrets, you might need to adjust that image. These women are far more than just pretty faces to arrange your headdress and giggle with. First off, your ladies-in-waiting are not commoners plucked from obscurity. They are noble women themselves, often from powerful and influential families, carefully chosen for their lineage, connections, and suitability for court life. Their job description is extensive. Yes, they assist you with the intimate details of your daily life, helping you dress in those complicated layered outfits, attending to your personal hygiene, perhaps even bathing you. They are your constant companions, expected to provide entertainment. Many were skilled in singing, playing musical instruments, or dancing, engage in polite conversation, and generally ensure you are never, ever alone. They also play a crucial public role, forming part of your retinue at all important court events, from banquets and ambassadorial receptions to religious ceremonies and masques. To fulfill these duties, they needed to be well educated, often proficient in several languages, and were universally expected to maintain impeccable moral standards, or at least give a very convincing performance of doing so. But here's where it gets really interesting: their influence. While these ladies weren't typically making laws or leading armies, though some, as widowed estate holders, did manage local political affairs, they wielded a significant amount of what we might call soft power. They had your ear, princess. Constant, direct access. And in a royal court, access to the queen or a high-ranking princess was a very valuable commodity. Through this proximity, they could advance petitions for their own families or for others they favored, secure patronage, lucrative positions, grants of land, advantageous marriages for their relatives, and build extensive networks of influence. Many noble women sought positions as ladies-in-waiting not for any official salary, which was often minimal or non-existent, but precisely for this social and political capital. Queens, in turn, were expected to use their households, their circle of female attendants, as an extension of their own political influence, making appointments, offering patronage, and generally getting things done through this network. So your ladies were right in the thick of court politics, constantly observing, negotiating, and vying for access and influence, often promoting their own interests and those of their kin. So are these women your loyal best friends, your trusted confidants? It's complicated. Some undoubtedly formed genuine bonds of affection and loyalty with the princess or queen they served. They shared daily life, witnessed moments of joy and sorrow, and could become true companions. However, their loyalties were often divided. They were, after all, members of their own noble families, with their own ambitions and agendas to promote. They served as crucial links between their kin and the court, building bridges and maintaining alliances. And yes, this often involved a bit of intelligence gathering. Queens frequently required their ladies-in-waiting to pass along information about other court members, their families, and the general political temperature. So your lady-in-waiting might be listening to your deepest secrets one moment and reporting them, or a carefully curated version, to her uncle, the powerful Duke of Somewhere, the next. It was a delicate, balancing act. They could be incredibly powerful allies. History is full of examples of ladies-in-waiting who courageously supported their mistresses through perilous times. Think of the ladies who stood by Catherine of Aragon during the tumultuous period of her divorce from Henry VIII, or those who played roles in assisting Isabella of France, yes, her again, in her audacious coup against her husband, Edward II. Their loyalty in such moments could be a lifeline. However, their proximity to power also made them, and by extension you, vulnerable. If a queen or princess became unpopular, or if her ladies were perceived as having too much influence, they could become targets. Misogynistic attitudes were rife, and powerful women at court were sometimes accused of greed, immodesty, manipulating the monarch, or even darker deeds like witchcraft or poisoning, especially if they were seen as supplanting male advisors, or if tensions were high between the monarch and other factions. Alice Perrers, who served Queen Philippa but became the mistress of King Edward III in his later years, wielded enormous influence, but faced severe political repercussions and accusations once the king died and her protection waned. And let's not forget the emotional toll on the ladies-in-waiting themselves. Their lives were largely dictated by your needs and your schedule, princess. They were expected to put your welfare above that of their own husbands and children, whom they might see infrequently if they were in permanent attendance at court. They traveled with you on those arduous journeys, nursed you when you were ill, shared your confinements during childbirth, and were privy to your most private moments and moods. It was a demanding, often exhausting, and emotionally taxing existence, lived constantly in the public eye yet within the intensely personal sphere of the royal household. They were the unsung support system, the gatekeepers, the networkers, and sometimes the silent power brokers behind the throne. Your survival and success as a princess could very well depend on the loyalty, cunning, and connections of these indispensable, and often underestimated, women. Life in a medieval court, princess, was not for the faint of heart. Beyond the silks and jewels, the banquets and balls, it was a relentless arena of power plays, political intrigue, and ever-present peril. As a princess, especially an unmarried one, your direct political authority was typically quite limited. Your primary functions were to be an emblem of your dynasty, a well-behaved and accomplished young lady, and, most importantly, a valuable piece in the intricate chess game of royal marriage alliances. Your power was usually more about potential. The potential to forge an alliance, to bear an heir, to bring a dowry, than about present-day command. However, once married and elevated to the status of queen consort, your capacity for influence could expand significantly, though it was often indirect. Writers like Christine de Pizan, in works such as The Treasure of the City of Ladies, articulated the concept of prudential politics for a princess or queen. This wasn't about legislating or leading armies, but about wielding moral influence, acting as a peacemaker, and offering wise counsel to your husband, the king. A virtuous and prudent queen, it was argued, could lay the foundation for justice in the realm by her example, and by mediating between the prince and his people. She might advise her husband to avoid costly and destructive wars, using her supposedly sweeter disposition to temper masculine aggression and rashness. De Pizan noted how many great blessings, including peace treaties, had been brought about by the intervention of queens and princesses. In some cases, particularly if her husband was absent, incompetent, or if she was widowed with a young heir, a queen could step into the role of regent, wielding very real and direct political power. Isabella of France, our recurring example of a princess who definitely made waves, famously ruled as regent for her young son Edward III after she orchestrated the overthrow of her husband, Edward II. However, such direct rule by a woman was often viewed as a temporary necessity and could be fraught with challenges to its legitimacy, requiring strong alliances with male nobles to maintain. But whether you were a demure unmarried princess or an influential queen consort, the court itself was a viper's nest. It was a dazzling, intoxicating, and incredibly dangerous environment, teeming with ambitious nobles, scheming courtiers, favor seekers, and spies, all jockeying for position, wealth, titles, or simply to avoid being on the losing side of the next political upheaval. Your marriage prospects, the size of your dowry, the health of your children, your relationship with the king, everything about you was fodder for court gossip, speculation, and political maneuvering. Loyalties were as shifting as sand. The courtier who showered you with compliments today might be whispering accusations against you tomorrow, if it served their interests or those of their faction. You had to learn to read the subtle currents of power, to discern true friends from flattering enemies, and to tread very, very carefully. And when things went wrong, they could go spectacularly, publicly, and often fatally wrong. Royal scandals were the blockbuster entertainment of the medieval period, and princesses were frequently at the epicenter, sometimes as victims, sometimes as instigators. Consider the infamous Tourdonel affair in 1314. King Philip IV of France's own daughters-in-law, Margaret of Burgundy and Blanche of Burgundy, and, to a lesser extent, Joan of Burgundy, were accused of committing adultery with two Norman knights in the Tourdonel, a tower in Paris. The accusations were allegedly initiated by Philip's own daughter, Isabella of France. Yes, the very same Isabella, who would later become Queen of England and orchestrate her own fair share of drama. The accused knights, Walter and Philip of Anne, were subjected to brutal torture, confessed, and were then horrifically executed. Flayed alive, castrated, broken on a wheel, and then hanged, according to most accounts. The princesses, Margaret and Blanche, were found guilty of adultery, had their heads shaven, a mark of deep shame, and were sentenced to life imprisonment. Margaret, who was married to Philip's heir Louis, conveniently died under suspicious circumstances in her prison cell, shortly after Louis ascended to the throne, thus clearing the way for him to remarry and secure a less scandalous lineage. This scandal didn't just ruin lives. It had profound dynastic implications for the French crown, and is even cited by some historians as a contributing factor to the succession disputes that eventually led to the 100 Years' War between England and France. A few misbehaving princesses, and a century of conflict. No big deal. Poisoning was another insidious threat that haunted medieval courts. It was considered a particularly nefarious crime, worse than a straightforward sword fight because of its secretive and cowardly nature. While the affair of the poisons in 17th century France, which implicated nobles and even King Louis XIV's mistress in a network of poisoners, is a later example. The fear, and indeed the practice, of using inheritance powders or other toxic concoctions to eliminate rivals or inconvenient spouses existed much earlier. Accusations of poisoning, whether true or false, could be a potent weapon to destroy an enemy or seize their property. As a princess, you'd always have to be wary of what you ate and drank, especially if you had powerful enemies. Beyond social ruin or a sneaky dose of arsenic, your life as a princess was often physically dangerous, simply because you were a valuable political asset. In times of war or political instability, which were frequent, you could be kidnapped by rival factions and held for a hefty ransom. You might be used as a hostage to guarantee the terms of a treaty or to ensure the good behavior of your family. Your personal safety was directly tied to the shifting fortunes of your dynasty. If your family fell from power, or if you found yourself on the losing side of a rebellion or succession crisis, your own position became incredibly precarious. Imprisonment, exile, or even execution were very real possibilities. The stories of queens like Brunhild and Fredegund, early medieval Frankish rulers whose reigns were filled with daring power grabs, assassinations, and bitter rivalries, illustrate the brutal stakes. Brunhild, after a long and tumultuous career, was ultimately captured by her enemies and executed by being tied to the tails of wild horses and torn apart. Not exactly a fairy tale ending. Let's revisit Isabella of France for a moment, as her life story is a masterclass in navigating these perils and creating a few of her own. Born a princess of the powerful French Capetian dynasty, she was married off at 12 to King Edward II of England, a man whose reign was plagued by his controversial favoritism towards men like Piers Gaveston, and later, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Initially, Isabella tried to play the role of the dutiful queen, even attempting to form a working relationship with Gaveston. She bore Edward 4 children, including the future Edward III, and for a time seemed to be a supportive, if perhaps increasingly disillusioned, consort. However, Edward II's reliance on the Despensers, whom Isabella came to detest, led to her increasing marginalization at court. She was stripped of her lands, her household was purged of her French attendants, and even her children were, for a time, removed from her care. This was a dangerous position for a queen. But Isabella was not one to suffer in silence. In 1325, she was sent to France on a diplomatic mission to negotiate a treaty with her brother, King Charles IV. She seized the opportunity. Once in France, she refused to return to England unless Edward dismissed the Despensers. She then formed an alliance, and a very public affair, with Roger Mortimer, an exiled English baron who was a bitter enemy of Edward and the Despensers. Together, they raised a mercenary army, secured ships, and in September 1326, invaded England. Their invasion was surprisingly successful. Support for Edward II, already unpopular due to his disastrous reign and the greed of the Despensers, crumbled. Edward fled, was eventually captured, and forced to abdicate in favor of his young son, Edward III, in January 1327. Isabella and Mortimer then ruled England as regents for the teenage king. During their regency, they enriched themselves considerably, granting themselves vast estates and sums of money, which quickly made them unpopular. Edward II died in captivity at Berkeley Castle in September 1327, under circumstances that remain highly suspicious. Many believe he was murdered on the orders, or at least with the tacit approval, of Isabella and Mortimer to prevent any chance of his restoration. Isabella's reign as the she-wolf of France, as she came to be known, was relatively short-lived. In 1330, the young Edward III, now 18, staged his own coup. He had Roger Mortimer arrested and executed for treason, and his mother, Isabella, was forced into a comfortable but politically powerless retirement. She lived out the rest of her days in various royal residences, still wealthy and able to attend court and see her grandchildren, but her direct influence on English politics was over. Isabella's life demonstrates the extraordinary risks and opportunities faced by a medieval princess. From a political pawn in an arranged marriage to a spurned queen, a rebel leader, a powerful regent, and finally, a deposed figurehead. Glamorous? Hardly. Dangerous? Absolutely. Her story is a stark reminder that for a medieval princess, survival often depended on a ruthless combination of cunning, courage, and a willingness to play the deadly Game of Thrones with the highest possible stakes. The very power she seized was inherently precarious, built on alliances and circumstances that could, and did, shift against her. In the turbulent, often brutal world of medieval royalty, where earthly power was fleeting and life itself uncertain, you'd think a princess would need a pretty solid spiritual lifeline. And you'd be right. The Catholic Church wasn't just a part of life in medieval Europe. For many, it was life, permeating every aspect of existence, from the grandest state ceremonies to the most private daily routines. Its influence was inescapable, shaping not only your understanding of the cosmos, but also your moral code, your social obligations, and even your calendar. As a princess, your relationship with the church would be multifaceted. On one hand, it was an institution of immense power that legitimized your family's rule. Coronations, for example, were deeply religious ceremonies conducted by high-ranking clergy, like the Archbishop of Canterbury in England. On the other hand, it offered a framework for personal piety, a source of comfort, and a set of rituals that structured your days and provided meaning in a world often characterized by chaos and violence. Everyone, from the king down to the lowliest peasant, was expected to attend church services, usually on a weekly basis. These services were conducted in Latin, a language that most of the congregation, including perhaps even some nobles, wouldn't fully understand. You, as an educated princess, might have a better grasp of it, but for many, the priest was the sole interpreter of scripture and divine will. He would deliver sermons, often based on the Bible, instructing people on how to live a good Christian life, and reminding them of the ever-present realities of sin, judgment, heaven, hell, and the rather uncomfortable waiting room known as purgatory. The church calendar, with its cycle of feasts, fasts, and holy days, dictated the rhythm of the year. Major life events, your baptism, your marriage, and eventually your funeral, were all presided over by the church. Beyond these public displays of faith, private devotion played a crucial role in the life of a medieval princess. Prayer was a constant. You would pray before meals, at set times throughout the day, mirroring the monastic divine office or hours, and in the solitude of your private chamber or chapel. This wasn't just a quick, "now I lay me down to sleep." Medieval prayer could be an intensely physical and emotional experience, involving various postures like kneeling, standing, sitting, or even lying prostrate on the floor in an act of profound humility. For wealthy lay people like yourself, princess, one of the most prized possessions for private devotion was a book of hours. These were personal prayer books, often exquisitely handwritten and lavishly illuminated, with vibrant miniatures and gold leaf on fine parchment. They contained a collection of prayers, psalms, and readings organized according to the canonical hours of the day: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, none, vespers, and compline. The core of most books of hours was the Hours of the Virgin, a cycle of prayers dedicated to Mary, often accompanied by beautiful illustrations depicting scenes from her life. Owning such a book was not only a tool for your spiritual life, but also a significant status symbol, a testament to your piety, your literacy, and your family's wealth. Using it would involve reciting the designated prayers at the appropriate times, a structured way to sanctify your day and maintain a personal connection with the divine. Think of it as your medieval mindfulness app, but infinitely more beautiful and significantly more expensive, requiring no subscription fees, but a hefty initial investment. Confession was another cornerstone of medieval religious life, and for someone of your standing, this often involved a personal confessor. While commoners confessed to their parish priest, high-status individuals, including royalty, merchants, and lesser nobles, often sought permission from the papal office known as the Apostolic Penitentiary to have their own personal confessor. This priest could be part of your household, travel with you, hear your confessions in private, and offer tailored spiritual guidance and absolution. This was a position of immense trust and potential influence. Your confessor was an intermediary between you and God, privy to your innermost thoughts, your sins, your fears, and your hopes. Such a relationship could be a profound source of psychological and spiritual support, a rare space for confidential disclosure, and a life lived largely in the public eye. The confessor, demanding profound empathy and discretion, was a critical pillar in your spiritual well-being. In a life that was often fraught with uncertainty, political danger, physical discomfort, and strict societal constraints, faith could offer a powerful sense of solace and meaning. The rituals of the church, both public and private, provided structure and a sense of order. The belief in divine justice and an afterlife could offer comfort in the face of earthly suffering or injustice. For some medieval women, intense emotional expression, such as weeping during prayer, was considered a sign of true devotion and a legitimate way to connect with God, particularly when other avenues of intellectual or public religious engagement were limited. For others, particularly those who felt trapped by societal expectations like arranged marriages, a life of religious devotion within a convent could sometimes be seen as an alternative path, though convent life itself came with its own set of rules, anxieties, and internal struggles. Thus, for you, princess, religion was an intricate tapestry woven through every fiber of your existence, a source of authority and control, but also a deeply personal wellspring of comfort, guidance, and perhaps, in the quiet moments of prayer, with your beautifully illuminated Book of Hours, a fleeting sense of peace. So, you've navigated the treacherous waters of a royal childhood, education, and marriage. You've learned to smile politely while your stomach churns from questionable feast food, or the latest courtly backstabbing. Now comes the main event, the primary reason for your existence as a medieval princess, especially once you're married, the heir factory. Your womb is not your own. It's a dynastic asset, and the pressure to produce is relentless, particularly for that all-important male heir who can secure the succession and prevent the kingdom from spiraling into chaos. This isn't a one-and-done deal, princess. You're expected to keep churning them out. Why the urgency for multiple offspring? Because, as we've established, infant and child mortality rates were appallingly high. Even if you successfully delivered a healthy baby, there was no guarantee it would survive its first year, let alone reach adulthood. Diseases we now vaccinate against, or treat with simple antibiotics, were rampant and deadly. So you needed spares. And then spares for the spares. It was a grim biological numbers game, and you were the star player, whether you wanted to be or not. Every single pregnancy, every single birth, is like stepping back into that perilous birthing chamber we discussed earlier, only this time it's your body on the line. Again and again. All those dangers, infection, hemorrhage, exhaustion, complications we can't even imagine dealing with today without modern medicine, are your constant companions through multiple pregnancies. Historians estimate that more than 1 in 3 women in some medieval periods might have died during their childbearing years, a direct consequence of the risks associated with pregnancy and childbirth. Even if you survived the delivery itself, you could suffer debilitating injuries that might leave you unable to have more children, or simply leave you physically and emotionally traumatized for the rest of your life. There was no concept of adequate recovery time or family planning. As soon as you were deemed physically capable, the expectation was to get pregnant again, to continue fulfilling your dynastic duty. It was a relentless cycle of biological risk and royal obligation. Imagine the emotional roller coaster this entailed. The anxiety of each pregnancy, the fervent hope for a healthy child, especially a son who could secure your husband's lineage and your own position at court. Then, the crushing grief of miscarriages, which were tragically common, or the heartbreak of losing an infant or young child to illness. Isabella of Parma, an 18th century princess whose experiences echo earlier medieval realities, endured half a dozen miscarriages during her short and politically pressured marriage. And through all this personal pain and physical ordeal, the court is watching. Your husband is watching. The entire kingdom, in a way, is watching and waiting. Are you fulfilling your most sacred duty? Are you providing the necessary heirs? The weight of this expectation, combined with the very real physical dangers and the profound emotional toll of potential loss, made the role of royal mother one of the most challenging and hazardous aspects of being a medieval princess. Your body was, in essence, a political battleground, and your reproductive success was a matter of state security. All right, princess, Let's assume you've successfully produced an heir or two, or 10, like Eleanor of Castile, though with a high attrition rate. Your work in the baby-making department might slow down, but the dangers of medieval life certainly don't. Now you have to worry about surviving everything else, from the questionable medical care to the ever-present threat of dynastic disputes that could see you, your children, or your entire family on the losing end of a rather pointy stick. If you fall ill as a princess, you might think you'd get the best medical attention money can buy. And you would, according to medieval standards. But best is a very relative term when the prevailing medical theory revolves around the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to this ancient Greek system, refined by Galen, your health depended on these humors being in perfect balance. If you had a fever, for example, it was clearly because you had an excess of blood. The obvious solution? Bloodletting. A doctor, or perhaps more commonly a barber surgeon, yes, the same chap who cuts hair and shaves beards, would open a vein with a lancet, or apply some fashionable blood-sucking leeches to draw off the offending surplus. Feeling a bit down, anxious, or melancholic? That would be an overabundance of black bile, my dear. The cure for that might involve laxatives, herbal purges, or perhaps just some stern prayers and a cold compress, while everyone discreetly avoids eye contact and wonders if they should start measuring you for a coffin. Diagnosis itself was an art form. Your medieval physician would solemnly examine the color, smell, and sometimes even the taste of your urine. The urine flask was practically the doctor's emblem, much like the stethoscope is today. They'd feel your pulse, observe your general appearance, and listen to your account of your symptoms. And, very importantly, they'd consult the stars. Astrology played a significant role in medieval medicine, as it was believed that the positions of the moon and planets influenced the body's humors and determined the most auspicious times for treatment, or even when not to treat a patient. The Pope's own doctor, Guy de Chauliac, famously blamed the Black Death on an unfortunate conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars. So, your recovery might depend as much on planetary alignment as on any earthly remedy. Treatments, beyond bloodletting and purges, involved a wide array of herbal concoctions. Some of these, based on plants like willow bark, a source of salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin for pain relief, or garlic and myrrh for their antimicrobial properties, might have had genuine, if limited, efficacy. However, the medieval pharmacopoeia also included less appealing and decidedly less effective ingredients, such as crushed beetles, powdered unicorn horn, good luck sourcing that, or for a toothache, perhaps a cooked mouse applied directly to the sore spot. If your condition worsened, you could expect more leeches, more prayers, and the priest being summoned to administer last rites, just in case the cure turned out to be, well, fatal. Surgery, if absolutely necessary for things like bladder stones or external ulcers, was performed without effective anesthesia, unless you count passing out from the sheer agony, and with tools that hadn't seen a good sterilization since the last crusade. Wine might be used as a rudimentary antiseptic, but the concept of germ theory was centuries away. Disease was often attributed to bad air, miasma, demonic influence, or, most conveniently, as a punishment from God for your sins or the sins of your people. So if you got a nasty infection from a minor cut, it wasn't because of bacteria. It was because you hadn't been pious enough. Good to know. Beyond the perils of medieval medicine, your very position as a princess, and especially as a queen or a potential heir, put you squarely in the crosshairs of dynastic disputes. The medieval period was rife with succession crises, rebellions, and outright wars fought over who had the rightful claim to a throne or a valuable piece of territory. If your father the king died without a clear male heir, or if your husband's claim to his throne was contested, you could find yourself and your children at the center of a violent power struggle. Marriages, as we've seen, were political alliances. But alliances could shift, treaties could be broken, and a princess from a formerly friendly kingdom could suddenly find herself viewed with suspicion, or even as an enemy if relations between her birth family and her marital family soured. You might be accused of treason, imprisoned, or used as a bargaining chip in negotiations. If your husband was overthrown, as happened to Edward II, your fate was incredibly uncertain. Isabella of France, his queen, went from being marginalized to leading the rebellion against him, eventually becoming regent. But even her power was ultimately curtailed by her own son. Such was the volatile nature of royal power. You could be a queen one day and a prisoner the next. The Game of Thrones was not just a game. It was a deadly reality, and as a princess, you were always a player, whether you wanted to be or not. Your survival often depended less on your virtues or skills, and more on the political wins and the strength of your faction. So you've somehow managed to dodge death by childbirth, survived the well-intentioned but often lethal medieval medical treatments, and haven't yet been imprisoned or executed in a dynastic squabble. What's the end game for a medieval princess? If you're exceptionally lucky and play your cards very, very carefully, you might live to a ripe old age, perhaps as a respected dowager queen, wielding subtle influence from behind the scenes, or enjoying a peaceful retirement in a well-endowed convent. But for many, the happily ever after was far more elusive. One common path, especially if you were a princess who wasn't the direct heir or married to the current king, was to be used, yet again, as a political tool through a strategic second marriage if your first husband inconveniently died. Or you might be relegated to a convent, not necessarily out of piety, but as a convenient way to remove you from the political stage or the marriage market, especially if your continued presence at court was awkward or threatening to the ruling powers. If you did manage to become queen consort and outlive your husband, your position could be powerful, but also precarious. As queen mother to a young king, you might serve as regent, as Isabella of France did. This offered a period of direct rule, but it was often fraught with challenges from ambitious nobles who resented female authority or sought to control the young monarch themselves. Your regency would be a constant balancing act, requiring immense political skill, strong alliances, and a healthy dose of ruthlessness to maintain control and protect your son's inheritance. And once your son came of age, he might, as Edward III did with Isabella, decide he'd had enough of your guidance, and politely, or not so politely, usher you into retirement. For some princesses and queens, falling from favor was a swift and brutal descent. Political tides could turn with alarming speed. An accusation of treason, adultery, as in the Tortonelle affair, witchcraft, or simply backing the wrong faction in a power struggle could lead to imprisonment, the stripping of your lands and titles, and in the worst cases, execution. The historical record is littered with queens and noblewomen who rose to great heights, only to meet tragic ends. Think of Anne Boleyn or Catherine Howard in the Tudor period. Though the medieval era had its own share of dramatic downfalls like that of Brunhild, your survival depended not just on your own actions, but on the shifting loyalties and ambitions of those around you. Even if you avoided these dramatic fates, the daily grind of medieval life, even for royalty, took its toll. The constant childbearing, the unhygienic living conditions, despite the tapestries and furs, the limited and often unsafe medical care, and the stress of court life meant that living into what we would consider old age was an achievement in itself. Many princesses and queens died relatively young, from complications of childbirth, infectious diseases, or simply the cumulative wear and tear of a harsh existence. What about the fairy tale ending? The one where you find true love, live happily ever after, and rule wisely and justly with your charming prince? While instances of genuine affection and successful partnerships undoubtedly occurred, they were often the exception rather than the rule, a fortunate accident in a system designed for political expediency. The pervasive ideal of courtly love, with its emphasis on unattainable desire and suffering, perhaps reflected a longing for an emotional connection that was often absent in the pragmatic reality of royal marriages. So if you, a modern individual, were suddenly thrust into the life of a medieval princess, your chances of surviving in a way that aligns with modern expectations of health, happiness, autonomy, and personal fulfillment would be slim to none. You'd be contending with a world where your birth was a political calculation, your childhood a preparation for duty, your marriage a strategic transaction, your body a vessel for dynastic continuity, and your daily life a complex navigation of ritual, restriction, and ever-present risk. You wouldn't have the medical care to survive common illnesses or the dangers of childbirth. You wouldn't have the personal freedom to choose your own path or your own partner. You wouldn't have the sanitation or hygiene to avoid constant discomfort and disease. And you wouldn't have the psychological resilience, shaped by modern ideals of individualism and self-determination, to easily endure a life so thoroughly dictated by the demands of status and the relentless pressures of a brutal and unforgiving era. The romantic image of the medieval princess, the damsel in distress waiting for her knight, or the serene queen ruling with effortless grace, is largely a fiction. The reality was far more complex, far more challenging, and far more dangerous. These women were survivors, strategists, and often silent sufferers, in a world that demanded everything from them and offered true agency to very few. They navigated their gilded cages with varying degrees of success, some finding ways to wield influence and leave their mark on history, others succumbing to the many perils that defined their existence. And that, my friends, is why you, with your modern sensibilities, your expectation of a warm shower, your quaint desire for a marriage based on love, and your understandable aversion to lead-based cosmetics and public executions, probably wouldn't survive a week as a medieval princess. It was a tough gig, and frankly, you're much better off right here, right now, with your Wi-Fi, your antibiotics, and your blessedly uncursed pillows. Thank you for joining us on this little trip back to the not-so-glamorous life of medieval royalty. If you found this journey into the past even mildly diverting, or if it made you appreciate your central heating just a little bit more, please do hit that like button. It really does help us out. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing to the channel for more historical deep dives that separate the fairy tales from the frequently foul facts. Until next time, sleep well and be grateful you weren't born a princess in the 14th century.